House of the Dragon has come back and gone, which means I've been making excuses for my faves. But in all seriousness, the time between season 1 and season 2, I have rewatched the show and revisited the source material, Fire and Blood. Coming into the series during season 1, I had expectations of how the show would play out. While for me, there are certainly some key issues with House of the Dragon in terms of how it has chosen to tell its story, I can also recognize that it is trying to do two things. One, tell its own story, and two, balance out the multiple political subtext in the work in a way that is more balanced than the end of Game of Thrones.
If we choose you, will you wear the crown? Will you lead the Seven Kingdoms to the best of your abilities from this day until your last day?
Why do you think I came all this way?
Especially when it comes to the ultimate issue of Rhaenyra Targaryen facing off against usurpation of her throne due to her gender. There are larger issues to consider when viewing Fire and Blood as source material, which first came up again with the season premiere episode that saw Blood and Cheese playing out very different from in the books. I have larger things to say about book purity, and I'll save that towards the end, but I think what is key to my present understanding of Fire and Blood is that it serves several purposes narratively. Yes, it's a history of Westeros that informs the legacy of the Targaryens, highlights for the audience the deeper challenges that Daenerys' heritage can bring. It also, in typical George R.R. Martin fashion, plays with how we consume sources and history. We know A Song of Ice and Fire is a series that pushes against the expectations of the fantasy genre. By extension, I think it's necessary to view Fire and Blood as not just an extension of the series, but a critique of historical text itself. We're supposed to look at it and be critical of the subtext, the things just below the surface.
The dragon will only accept a dragon lord to write it. Also say the histories.
Valyrian histories, written to gild us in glory.
I have decided, views be damned, this will be a semi-spoiler video because I don't want to risk ruining anyone's experience, and I realized last time that some people have different ideas of what a spoiler is than me, so rather than just upset anyone, I'm going to say that this video will have spoilers at certain points that tells us about the Dance of the Dragon. I will make sure they're properly labeled, that they are very skippable, and I'll also do my thoughts on House of the Dragon Season 2 separate from that, so you don't have to worry about being spoiled. We are going to meet each other halfway. Of course, we have seen that the show isn't a straight adaptation, so how much of that will even matter is yet to be determined, so we shall persevere. So we're going to go deeper into the history of Fire and Blood, how it sets up Dany's arc potential in the main series, and why I think a lot of us are reading it wrong, even though we're trying really to find the truth in it. But first, I know you want to ask about my thoughts on House of the Dragon Season 2, so let's start there. Overall, enjoyed the season. I actually really like the series so far. While I have my issues and quibbles, I usually do, even with shows I think are damn near perfect. To me, with the show, the acting is great. They bring some depth to characters that sometimes don't have them in the source material. Emma Darcy, Ewan, Tom especially have done a lot with the characters that can honestly be really flat. Their focus on the humanity of their emotions makes them even more compelling, even when they're not given a lot of space to make that clear. One example is when the actor who played Aegon talked about the steps meeting he had with Helena and how he perceived it as he was acting it, which was very different from how it was edited and shown on screen. But I think it's great that they are having this insights about these characters and trying, even with a piece of shit like Aegon, to create something that is thoughtful and engaging.
Aegon feels completely alone, like no one really understands or appreciates the pain he's in. And seeing that look in Helena's eyes when they cross on the stairs, they don't say much to each other, but they communicate through pain. Because while the show has failed to do the two sides are equally bad thing, I think it's important that the actors themselves are invested in what they're doing. Cinematography-wise, there were beautiful moments, and I think it really honored characters like Rhaenys, who has been a standout the entire time. I also enjoyed spending more time with a character like Alice. Game of Thrones was notorious for not understanding fully how to blend the magical aspects of the story with the grounded feel they wanted to do, so I'm glad that we have some magic actually back on the show. What I think is the biggest issues with House of the
the Dragon is that it is in conflict with a bunch of different things. The general audience, in my opinion, has been really fed a diet of very low magic fantasy, nothing too complicated, nothing too intricate, very straightforward classifications as easy as they come, because that makes it adaptable for everyone. As imperfect as The Witcher is, and trust me, they're right about that series. Part of what I liked about season 1 was how it tried to play with the immortality of the characters and what it is like to walk around in that world ageless. But it was hard for general audiences to follow that. So even though season 2 was arguably a much worse season, because it was a more straightforward narrative, it was more palpable and therefore had a better critical score. Game of Thrones didn't help itself by not making it clear why magic was so important to the story, unless it was totally impossible to ignore, which is why The Long Night, something that is so pinnacle and important to the entire story, happens in one episode, because they took the focus away from the truth that The Long Night is the actual conflict that matters, not the Iron Throne. But themes are for book reports, so. While not everyone who watches House of the Dragon watched Game of Thrones, the template for fantasy was very light going into one and the other. The execution is also part of the problem of why the magic in House of the Dragon being reintegrated is so unsatisfying. If we take Daemon's storyline, for example, the problem is not that it exists. I think showing the layers of his character is really important, especially since he is responsible for Blood and Cheese, and the writers have decided to make tension between him and Rhaenyra for the sake of drama. And I think in order to validate that, they must continue to show why Daemon is not a totally noble, great partner for Rhaenyra. And I think that Daemon's second son connection to Aemon has been a huge theme that they've been exploring. I would really recommend for sort of like people who do deep dives on this. We have Game of Thrones historian, JJ, of course, Hills Alive, my homegirl who is Team Green. All these people do really good videos on TikTok and other platforms about this media. Of course, there is Alt, who all you guys watch anyway, so they don't need a plug. But I would definitely recommend these people on TikTok for their House of the Dragon themes, because they have gotten into a lot of this minutia much more than I will in this video. But that second son connection to Aemon has been a huge theme that they've been exploring, and I think that it had potential, except for the fact that Daemon and Aemon have never shared a single scene together where they actually talk to each other. And so it makes all of the idea that they say that, you know, Aemon is a creation of Daemon, and I'm like, where? What is an issue is that it's the pacing. While Aelis's magic has shown why it's so impactful and how it can change the minds of men, the pacing of how it all worked out was not really good, which was not helped by the writer's strike and the season cut from 10 to 8 episodes. And I definitely agree that not every episode needs to be a death or a battle. Plus, considering what we got in the first 4 episodes, I think we got plenty of blood. The problem is getting a satisfying conclusion to those internal storylines. The Daemon scenes remind me of the Game of Thrones season 2 scenes between Arya and Tywin Lannister. Those Arya and Tywin scenes were very relaxed, very different from the source material, and they allowed us to keep some bigger characters on screen longer. But they also made very little sense in the larger scheme of the story, because Arya then doesn't kill Tywin Lannister when she has an opportunity to do so, and that will always be weird.
Aemond, who he probably had a hand a bit in his creation.
Daemon going through all this narrative has some payoff, but it also makes him look deeply incompetent as a leader of men, the thing that is core in his character. Like, a part of the reason why Rhaenyra is married to Daemon is because he is a good leader of men, and she needs that as a consort because she was a woman and therefore wasn't raised to do these things.
And the symbols of authority are not jewels and gowns, but the shield and the sword.
Daemon is there to help buoy her flaws, and that isn't really shown there because he looks very incompetent. He got bodied by Sesame Street. And mind you, don't fuck with Sesame Street. Sesame Street is, the streets are hot. But as funny as that was, it also made him look ridiculous.
He must now rectify his grievous error, denounce your crimes, and dispense justice.
Getting to see Laena was good, but it also served to remind me that we barely got any time with that character. So while we can imagine she left an impact on Daemon's life, it would have been nice to see it. The same sort of thing about them hammering home the Aemon-Daemon parallels. We get it, but this would have been more interesting if we'd seen those characters share one single conversation. The only time they interact, it is a game recognized game moment, and that's it. But am I supposed to really believe that Damon has this impact in Eamon's life when I've never seen them interact? Allison's character is so deeply changed from the source material, but then they give Olivia Cook nothing to really do. This entire season of shaming and humbling her just feels very out of step with what we saw in the back half of last season. These two women are supposed to be friends turned rivals, and yet they have fully abandoned that rivalry to make Allison suffer under the weight of sexism more. It also doesn't seem to understand that Blood and Cheese, at least in my mind, would only start to solidify Allison's desire to see Team Black destroyed. They killed her grandchild and ruined her orgasm in the same moment.
Allison, stay with the king! Hold your ground!
Her motivation has always been, and we have seen from her conversation with her father, Otto Hightower, was the safety of her children. And she failed at that. But she doesn't try, therefore, to protect them. She is made into simply an audience avatar when it comes to shaming Aegon, but she already failed him by putting him in that position in the first place.
You are the challenge! You are the challenge, Aegon! Simply by living and breathing! And what they know, what everyone in the realm knows, in their blood and in their bones, is that one day you will be our king.
And I think it's this way that they don't want her to be complicit in things, but then they don't know what else to do if she's not complicit. It's like, rather than making her a savvy player like a Marjorie Tyrell or a softer Lady Olenna, they make her this sort of like almost Sansa type character, which she is not. And I'm talking about book Sansa, of course, not the abomination that we got in the latter half of Game of Thrones. Alicent was raised under one of the greatest political minds in Westeros, and they make it seem as if she's just frowning the entire time. She gets amazing scenes, her hair is fantastic, but they don't spend time on the things that matter. And when we do see Alicent, it's just repeating the same themes over and over again to the detriment of having that character on screen. And I even feel with the relationship she has with Kristen Cole, that's a relationship that would have made so much more sense if A, they had kept Alicent's original age and role in the narrative, and B, if they kept Alicent as trying to encourage Aegon to be king, because Cole is known as the kingmaker, and her being in cahoots with the man who is helping rear her son into knighthood and they become a sexual relationship makes sense. And rather than doing that, they just kind of make Christian Cole seem even more of an incel than I thought. But you can check out what I feel about that on the B-side to this video on my Patreon.
Desire for women has brought me grief after grief.
With Rhaenyra, I feel a lot of things. I feel like she's such a great character, and I actually see why they're taking this perspective with her, especially in the books. She's laid up depressed for a while, and I think that's valid. Like, in a very short amount of time, her father has died, her son was murdered, and she had a severe miscarriage of the daughter that she's always wanted. These are things that would honestly very clearly make her sad and depressed. And I think we just needed some episodes where she wasn't in it, where all the characters don't have to be here, because that's okay. If we're going to see significant forward momentum in the story, it's okay to take a pause and let Emma take their wig off and just chill, okay? There are 73 episodes of Game of Thrones. Jon is not in all of them. Dany is not in all of them. Tyrion isn't even in all of them. We don't need to see every single beat that these characters are taking, because it just becomes very tedious, because this is already a very short war. We can do the minutia of it, but we need to like actually keep things moving. And I don't mind that Rhaenyra isn't rushing to do war crimes. You see how I don't start warfare even though I have justifications? Very demure, very mindful, very cutesy. What I do mind is that they are circling around the idea of her using their dragons, and we still don't fully understand the relationships that these characters have to each other, because we skipped through so much. Season 1 went by so fast, and I feel like because we skipped around so often then, there are a lot of gaps in the story. Relationships are underdeveloped all around, from familial to romantic ones. Bela and Rhaena are woefully underdeveloped, which is extremely vexing considering the racism they have to deal with for just existing. And I'm not saying to prioritize them more than the small folk, just to give them more significance in the scenes we do have. Like in the season finale, Rhaena is there, but she doesn't speak at all. Like, her entire storyline has been like 3 minutes max, and I'm like, girl, that could have been an email, and that's embarrassing. Like it just, and then they also ruin Jane Eyre. I wish we could go back and slow down season 1 and just have a full season with that younger cast. I think having a second season be the end half of last season and everything up here being the stuff that we've seen up until the dragon seed. Like that scene of Rhaenyra and the dragons would have been like a great finale for season 2, because the dance only lasts 3 years. It's not a long war, but we have speed run through it to get to this point, only to keep dallying. For what? The shadow of other things. And I fundamentally think we are seeing with House of the Dragon the way in which there's a limit to nuance when an audience is not willing to see it. It's not solely a problem with fantasy. We've seen this happen with the rise of difficult men media, where even though the narrative is giving you something very textually and morally rich, the audience still ends up siding with the narrator. With Game of Thrones, you at least had all these seasons to see these individual characters. In the books, you read their POV. It was possible to root for Jaime, Dany, Sansa, Stannis, Davos, and you know me, I'm a Stannis girly. Ours is the Fury. If there's a Baratheon one true king, it's him. Sorry, I don't like Renly. It's not Pride anymore. I don't have to lie. Renly sucks. And I'll even add to this. If Renly had just minded his own business, he could have been heir to the throne anyway, because it's a patriarchy. And Stannis had no male children, but you unsecured your own back because you listened to your man in the streets. You should have been smarter. That's why you got stabbed. See, I love Brienne, but her loyalty.
You having an unnatural allegiance to losers is not like you.
Anyway, I'm not talking about that right now. But even in all that storytelling, you had people who simply didn't want to understand the messages of the show or the books or any of that nuance. And the show itself honestly didn't help, especially with female characters. You know, people do read A Song of Ice and Fire and still walk out of it holding these very binary readings of characters, even though we know they're much more than that. And it's even more complicated in a text like Fire and Blood, which is already written like a history text, and therefore we don't have a lot of sections of character development. We have snippets of information that you as the reader decide what is false, what is true. You are left to craft your own vision in some ways of what this is. How does that then translate to a television show where it has to then, on a certain level, have an objective storytelling? House of the Dragon has to do those multiple things: appeal to a mainstream audience, appeal to book fans, fantasy audiences, correct and learn from the mistakes of Game of Thrones, while still sticking to things that connect these two shows together to create marketing that retains that house pride with the Team Green, Team Black stuff, even though it shows a lack of understanding about the actual truth of the dance anyway.
Between Rhaenyra and Aegon, who would you have chosen?
I wouldn't have chosen either. It's all the choosing sides that made everything so horrible.
Sympathy to a certain degree about people trying to adapt something within a world, a universe that is now acknowledged was not a great adaptation. With Game of Thrones, that first series, people were more open to the book and the show being different and having certain changes until they didn't stick the landing. And because they didn't stick the landing, that trust isn't there. And when it comes to the writing of female characters in this show, I think they took the wrong lessons as well. I think they are so afraid of making Alicent like Kat or Rhaenyra like Dany that it loses the context of the perspectives of these characters that make them interesting. Alicent's perspective does not have to appeal to a modern audience to be engaging. She doesn't have to be sympathetic or likable to be worthy of a story being told. One of the reasons why people like Cersei is, despite being the worst, her story allowed her to be someone who killed whomever was in her way. She was still a victim of the patriarchy, and she wasn't as smart as she thought she was, but still had some bangers in her repertoire. Her blowing up the Sept of Baelor, even though it should have had consequences in the universe, and that was where it didn't, was a bomb-ass shot. And I liked it. Kat may be disliked for her treatment of Jon Snow, but I'm going to say this again. It made sense in the context of the world we have, and unless you properly explain that, she looks kind of crazy and weird. But even so, it is also impossible to act for nuance when people take the most cynical reading of a character. And Kat's probably the best example of this, because she is loving and generous and petty and classist and ambitious and intelligent and naive at the same time. But if you decide to dislike her, everything is her fault. If you're a defender, she's done nothing wrong. And because online, people take shit posting as serious reflections of characters, it creates this kind of worthless dialogue where people are arguing the most extreme points and realizing that, it's okay if Kat is not a good person and a good character. It's okay that she's flawed. Because she's bullying a teenager doesn't mean, and honestly, she didn't actually bully him like that, you guys are exaggerating. It's just more complicated than that. And trying to flatten that so much, and the response to those things is is why we end up the way that we are right now with Alicent and Rhaenyra being totally defanged, because audiences have already told people that they cannot handle this kind of character writing for women. You guys need to have monologues about people saying like, it was a mistake for me to ever, hate that child that was in my face.
And everything that's happened since then, all this horror that's come to my family, it's all because I couldn't love a motherless child.
Oh, fuck off.
Why? Now we have 2 scenes. This...
It's a story he once told about Aegon the Conqueror. The Conqueror.
And this...
You will enter as a conqueror.
Oh, fuck off.
And that lack of understanding and world building time taken also leads to people having like fundamentally misunderstandings about like what freedoms the character have. I see people think that Rhaenyra has all this freedom as a Targaryen princess, where if you know anything about the generations before her and after, you know that's not true. And even in her own narrative, that's not true. This is why I think it was a mistake personally to not start with the conquest and work forward and just jump into this, but that's a different story. All that yapping to say, the show is the show and the book is the book. I don't need them to be perfectly aligned. I think my adaptation anxiety worries about the little things because the issues with Game of Thrones were cumulative. In the books, when Ned is asked to be Hand of the King, he doesn't want to do it. And Kat thinks that if Ned doesn't go, it will offend the king. There's also the whole idea of Sansa marrying Joffrey, where she's like, that would be kind of lit. And that's Book Cat. In the show, Kat doesn't want Ned to go at all. The anxiety that Book Cat feels about the omen of the direwolf being killed and worry that the Baratheons will hurt their family if being slighted is important because omens are weird in this world and it can mean whatever you take it to mean. To me, I take it to believe that Ned's life was forfeit when Robert asked him to be Hand in the first place. But this is an important moment of showing how Kat believes these omens, her fear, her ambition, all of that. And people hate Kat for that. It's probably one of the first things that she does people think is a mistake. There's also this desire for Kat to know things that there was no way for her to know. Like, do you really think that she thought her sister and a guy she didn't care about conspired to kill her husband in order to like have said guy swoop in and marry her? That's an irrational 4D chess move. Because honestly, if this man is trying to still sleep with me after 16 years, he needs to be in therapy. Okay? Lysa has other problems. She need to get that child off her titty. It's not a thing that Kat was equipped to play. I think that most characters are not equipped to play. This is a story about nobility and honor being destroyed and dismantled by 1,000 cuts. And even when an audience has proven itself to not always get nuance, at the end of the day, you need to write for the audience that does. Otherwise, you train them to expect nothing and they will respond in kind. So while I get why House of the Dragon has at times been very messy and very weird, I think that they need to start writing for the audience they want and not the audience that they think they have. Because good writing, even if people have terrible takes, is still more important than trying to explain every single thing. What I will not forgive them for is that line where Rhaenyra's like, and history will remember you as, girl.
Cold queen. Grasping for power and then defeated.
Take that shit home. All right. This video is sponsored by Nebula. Look at my link down below in order to get 40% off your annual subscription to this streaming service created for viewers by creators. I have been making a lot of stuff these past few months, and I've been so happy to have 2 episodes of my anime court series be finally up on Nebula. So I decided to dive deep into the My Hero Academia waters and cover my feelings on the character of Endeavor, because I think that when we ask for complicated characters with nuance and we get them, we should then be able to discuss them in informative and compelling ways. So I talk about my feelings on Endeavor, my feelings on him as a father, as a character, and what he brings to the My Hero Academia world. No manga spoilers because I am still catching up on My Hero. I also talk biggest L be expanded from one panel to a significant portion of an episode. Anime Court has been one of my small joys, and I'm looking forward to tackling my next video, which will be again another Nebula exclusive, which will be about Mai from Yu-Gi-Oh! Because God, do I, as a former owner of a dual disc, have a lot of opinions about Mai from Yu-Gi-Oh! But again, if you haven't checked out Nebula yet, now is the perfect time. There is content from myself, from other creators, Nebula classes, podcasts, everything. Again, you can look down below at the link. Thank you so much for watching, and let's get back to this nerdy discussion of House of the Dragon. Earlier this month, A Song of Ice and Fire author George R.R. Martin posted and then deleted comments he made about season 2 of House of the Dragon on his Not a Blog blog. Now, something I want to make just exceptionally clear is that I think the show-only fans have not only the right to exist, obviously, but to not be bothered or tormented by book fans. When our streams overlap, that's fine, but I don't think that if you know someone is a fan of the show and a show-only person, that they need to be, like, told bit by bit why they're wrong. I think that while there is going to be a natural back and forth that will inevitably happen, they and people who are enjoying House of the Dragon, regardless of if they read the books or not, have the right to enjoy it without feeling attacked. Okay? Okay. What I do think is interesting is that when Blood and Cheese happened on the show and some fans felt underwhelmed by it, there was this whole back and forth, especially on TikTok where I saw it, where some of us were being accused of being bloodthirsty and wanting to traumatize a child actor and like wanting to have like terrible things happen to the young kid. What myself and others felt, I believe at the time and believe now, it was that this change was going to be problematic in terms of long-term consequences for all the characters that are involved and adjacent to it. For those who don't know, in Fire and Blood, when Blood and Cheese go on their mission of revenge, they find both Helena and Alicent in their quarters, along with Helena and Aegon's 3 children, Jaehaerys, his twin sister Jaehaera, and their younger brother Maelor. Helena attempts to give up herself to the men, but she is asked to choose between which of her sons. And she offers Maelor because he's so young, and she's thinking like he will be the least traumatized by this whole thing. And then she says,
"You hear that, little boy?" She's whispered to the younger son. "Your mama wants you dead."
And then kills Jaehaerys. This is super traumatic for everyone that witnesses it, especially Helena. And Maelor becomes an important symbolic character, especially when it comes to later moments and Helena's overall mental health. Martin mentions that this change of erasure, when it comes to Maelor, with no equivalent child, creates a butterfly effect that will impact the rest of the adaptation. This is correct, in my opinion. It is a significant change with significant consequences that come from them deciding they just didn't want to deal with a child actor. If noted madman Stanley Kubrick could protect the young actor who played Dany during The Shining, then there's no reason why, like, the team here couldn't have protected a young actor, but that goes besides the point. Quote from the blog, "When Ryan Condal first told me what he meant to do ages ago, back in 2022, I argued against it for all these reasons. I did not argue long or with much heat, however. The change weakened the sequence, I felt, but only a bit. And Ryan had what seemed to be practical reasons for it. They did not want to deal with casting another child, especially a 2-year-old toddler. Kids that young will inevitably slow down production, and there would be budget implications. But it was already an issue on House of the Dragon. It made sense to save money wherever we could. Moreover, Ryan assured me that we were not losing Prince Maelor, simply postponing him. Queen Helena could still give birth to him in season 3, presumably after getting with child late in season 2. That made sense to me, so I withdrew my objections and acquiesced to the change." Now, having seen the entire season, you can tell that it is like Maelor does not exist. There is no way for Helena to be pregnant with Maelor through Aegon.
My was destroyed. Did they tell you that? It burst into flames like a sausage on the spit.
Like, and I know that there are people who think maybe she'll have the child with Aemond. I don't think that that is going to happen either. So this young boy character is now gone. And this, in my opinion, goes back to the messiness of season 1. The time jumps, the lack of spending time defining any relationships between Rhaenyra and her siblings or any of the extended Targ family. When Rhaenyra says
that I would inflict such a thing on Helena of all people,
my first thought was like, we have no context for your relationship with Helena to say like, Helena of all people, we have no idea of what their relationship is. We also overall don't have any understanding of who Aegon and Helena are as parents, really. And because everyone at this point is so close in age casting wise, it's hard to even see Alicent as a grandmother. Like, she's supposed to be in her 40s. Like, mid to late 40s and being played by someone who's in her early 30s. So like there's a lot of just naturally awkward moments like this. Martin says Maelor by himself means little. He's a small child, does not have a line of dialogue, does nothing of consequence but die. But where and when and how, that does matter. None of that is essential, I suppose, but all of it does serve a purpose. It all helps to tie the storylines together. So one thing follows another in a logical and convincing manner. That's the key. Logical and convincing manner. And so far, I think one of the biggest issues that we see with certain changes is that they don't tend to follow a logical and convincing manner, especially the Alicent and Rhaenyra stuff. You know, Maelor's fate is directly tied to the outcome of the war, and he wasn't included and will very likely never be. It is a messy choice with a huge problem that builds upon how the show at times acts as though it doesn't have a very clear course towards its story. Like, you know why Maelor's important. The entire thing is written out. It's only like 200 something pages. So again, we will have to wait and see the conclusion of this series to know for sure if this change will be as impactful as Martin and some of us fans thinks it will be. I personally think that it will be. I think that it builds upon previous issues within the show, and I think that you don't have to be like, you know, a blood ninja or someone who like a blood knight to understand that this change is significant because what it does for the characters involved. And I think one of the biggest things about Blood and Cheese in the show is that it seems to not really matter to anyone except like the Daemon portion of the story. But yeah, it just was a very interesting change, and I wanted to make sure that I included it since I wrote and recorded the rest of the video before this blog came out. Also, I love my Aemon Targaryen shirt because, like, I'm Team Black, but I do love this kinslaying war criminal. All right, let's talk about the history of the Targaryens. This is a history video now, but it's fake history. Whatever, I'm a nerd. I just have nice boobs.
The Dance of Dragons, a true telling by Grandmaster Munkin, being a history of the war of Targaryen succession between the Princess Rhaenyra and Aegon, second of his name, that nearly destroyed the realm.
I got tired, so I'm sitting down. In the beginning, Aegon Targaryen, aka Aegon the Conqueror, started his conquest with his two sister wives, his older sister Visenya and his younger sister Rhaenys. Aegon's favorite was his younger sister Rhaenys. Visenya, Aegon married out of duty, and Rhaenys out of love. We know plenty about Visenya being stern, sensual, serious, harsh, where Rhaenys is playful, kind-hearted, and mischievous. Rhaenys is both exalted for her beauty and charm. While she has battle prowess, we see her early death and beauty craft her into this tragic figure. Hence why we see so many women named in honor of her, and we see a lot more men named after Visenya. Rhaenys dies during the First Dornish War when a scorpion goes through her dragon's eye and she is crushed by the weight of her dragon. Now, just as a note, getting a scorpion to go through a dragon's eye is very difficult, despite what they will have you believe on Game of Thrones. That's very hard. Not everyone can do that. Before she died, she gave birth to a son, Aenys. Then we have Visenya. Visenya was present and active in a lot of the war, to the point where I'd argue that she's even more important than almost Aegon, and she gets to be this larger-than-life warrior figure. We get told repeatedly that Visenya worked on securing the throne for Aegon, protected his person, ensured his succession as king, yet her giving birth to Maegor and his legacy as Maegor the Cruel in many ways taints Visenya as the lesser wife.
Visenya.
Rhaegar's first rider. And the first wielder of Dark Sister.
I hope you do not mean to use her as an example.
Why shouldn't I?
Maegor is known as Maegor the Cruel. He usurped his nephew's throne. He had 6 wives. He responded to any slight with violence. He in many ways secured Targaryen rule with his actions, but his cruelty doesn't just taint him. By extension, it taints his mother and what her legacy means, because all those things about her being involved in witchcraft and everything, they also get passed on to why Maegor is this exceptionally cruel Targaryen, especially in comparison to Aenys, who by all means is a very witch witless, bad king in general. It's also important to note that the current line is descended from Aegon and Rhaenys' children. This isn't to say that we shouldn't believe the rumors of Maegor being a violent and vengeful person, or how it connects to Visenya herself. This has some accounts to back it up. But just like with, say, a King Richard III, there's a level of mythologizing we must keep in mind when thinking about who is invested in these kind of narratives about these figures, as well as an undercurrent of women who are seen as too ambitious, being cast in a masculine or unsexual light. Plus, history is written by the winners, which is the context to which Fire and Blood is even written. Within the first 50 years of the post-conquest timeline for the Targaryen dynasty, we see two major issues come up just within that first and second generation of parents, children, and grandparents. The first is second sons being more aggressive and charming than the heir to the throne. If you've seen The Crown, this gets brought up a lot there too. There being a stoic heir who toes the line as much as possible, and then the spare, who might have a more engaging personality, physical attributes, etc.
Alongside that dull, dutiful, reliable, heroic strain runs another. The dazzling, the brilliant, the individualistic, and the dangerous.
So you have Aenys I, who was doing their best to reduce violence, who wanted to be loved. He was indecisive. He trusted too easily. He was the second Targaryen king and had 6 children, but he was ultimately unable to protect them from the small folk and the faith, who decided that they were actually not okay with incest. They were like, your dad can do it and he can get married twice, but that's it. Nor was he able to protect his own heir, Aegon, from his brother Maegor. When Otto Hightower says that
Daemon would be a second Maegor, or worse.
This isn't just speaking to Daemon's perceived aggression, but the weakness of Viserys I, just like the weakness of Aenys. And again, we will see this throughout Targaryen history of these second brothers coming in to take over when there's any perceived weakness of the actual heir. The second thing we will see is women getting screwed in the succession. Aegon the Conqueror wasn't the eldest of his siblings. That was Visenya, who he married out of duty, as we remember again. Before Maegor dies, he names his stepdaughter, great niece, Princess Araya, as heir to the throne. That means at his death, there were 3 contenders to the throne: Araya, Jaehaerys, who would become king, and Araya's mother, Queen Rhaena. Rhaena was the first grandchild of Aegon I through Prince Aenys. This complicated the succession because they didn't know if Rhaena should be put above her uncle in the first place. Eventually, Aenys would have more children, including 2 sons, Aegon and Jaehaerys. Aegon and Rhaena were married, and the faith was pissed and called the potential marriage an abomination. They still got married, and then they went on to do a royal progress without dragons, and were harassed and forced to take shelter from the small folk. Aenys died right after. Maegor took the throne instead of Aegon, and Aegon was eventually killed. This was an act of kinslaying that would mar Maegor forever. Also, very familiar.
I do regret that business with Luke.
Here, uncles killing their nephews. Not very nice. Maegor took Rhaena as one of his many brides. When it was argued that Rhaena, the firstborn, had the best claim, her gender was used against her and then later her daughter, which meant that Jaehaerys was crowned king. Something that would lead to resentment from Rhaena because she was like, I'm the eldest, I've dealt with all this fucking trauma, let me rule. And she would have been great at it. She's my favorite Targaryen woman. She literally drove her husband into like madness. She was no man's peace. And we know from House of the Dragon that another succession issue would happen, and once again an elder female with a good claim would be passed over for the eldest male grandchild. And in that case it was Princess Rhaenys in favor of the eldest grandson, Prince Viserys, even though she was the eldest grandchild.
And Lords vassal of the 7 kingdoms, the Prince Viserys Targaryen be made Prince of Dragonstone.
Rhaenys, a woman, would not inherit the Iron Throne.
And this is something that was divisive within the family itself. Jaehaerys' own queen, his sister wife Alicent, famously said, "A ruler needs a good head and a true heart. A not essential. If your grace truly believes that women lack the wit to rule, plainly, you have no further need of me. And this will be frequently cited as why Rhaenyra, despite being named heir, should be removed in favor of her younger half-brother. This is the succession crisis that built up to what we see in House of the Dragon.
The king's firstborn child.
Rhaenyra. A girl. No queen has ever sat the Iron Throne.
That is only by tradition and precedent,
If order and stability so concerns this council, then perhaps we shouldn't break 100 years of it by naming a girl heir.
Now, I understand that this might be to a certain level tedious, and they could have expressed this in many different ways earlier, like we get like a small snippet of it in the first episode, but I think this context is so important, especially Maegor. Like, I feel like they mention Maegor all the time, and he is responsible for a lot of the architecture that actually exists within King's Landing. But we have no context for who he is. Like, it's cool to see him in like the opening credits, but like, if we want to see the House of the Dragon series as a building up of Targaryen history, then we as the audience need to know what that history is, and we shouldn't have to read the book to find out. But anyway, let's get into the meat and potatoes House of the Dragon stuff.
For he knew the cold truth. The only thing that could tear down the House of the Dragon was itself.
We are told in universe, which is within the text itself, that Fire and Blood is written by Maester Yandel, who is writing the book in the current day using research from other contemporary maesters, who themselves are using sources that are biased. On Team Green, we have Septim Eustace, and then Mushroom, who served as a fool for Rhaenyra, is on Team Black. Therefore, even among already messy sources of Fire and Blood, most of what we know about the Dance of the Dragons is bias. Martin has said that Thomas B. Costin's Plantagenet series is a huge influence on Fire and Blood, and originally he wanted to just do a War of the Roses story, and then he ended up cutting it because everyone would know the conclusion of it. And it's really clear that House Plantagenet is a huge aesthetic influence on the series. The Plantagenets were a royal dynasty that ruled England for over 3 centuries, from the 12th to the 15th. The dynasty is separated into like 3 main parts: the Angevins, the Plantagenets proper, and then the houses of Lancaster and York, which battled during the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses is a huge influence on A Song of Ice and Fire, whereas the Dance of the Dragons has a lot in common with the Anarchy. The Anarchy was a period of civil war and political chaos in England that lasted from 1135 to 1153. It was caused because of a succession crisis following the death of King Henry I. His only legitimate son, William, had died in a boat accident known as the White Ship Disaster that didn't just kill his heir, but also 300 people. He left his daughter Matilda as his heir, and he made the lords pledge allegiance to her. However, when Henry died, his nephew, Stephen, seized the throne.
Hey, Stephen, I know looks can be deceiving, but I know I saw a light in you.
Matilda and her supporters fought to reclaim it, leading to a prolonged period of violence across England, and the anarchy would eventually end with the ascension of Matilda's son, King Henry II, which would mark the beginning truly of the Plantagenet dynasty. Clearly, on paper, there are a lot of similarities of how this would eventually become the baseline for the Blacks and the Greens. A lot of things are obviously changed because it's definitely like the conclusions are different, how everything plays out is very different, all of that. But it is a very interesting baseline for what we end up getting in the show and how you can see the impact of different things as they work. In Fire and Blood, we get these vague but strong ideas of the 2 women central to the conflict. Alicent is this charming, clever woman who does exactly what she's expected to do: have heirs and remain hot doing so. And she even at first has a good relationship with her stepdaughter. But when Alicent gives birth to Aegon, there's an expectation that this will secure Alicent's position even after Viserys. Quote, "For both Rhaenyra and Alicent aspired to be the first lady of the realm, and though the queen had given the king not 1 but 2 male heirs, Viserys had done nothing to change the order of succession." This reminds me a lot of the conflict between Anne Boleyn and her stepdaughter Mary Tudor, and if you know me, the Tudors is like my big historical fascination. And there's a quote that Anne said about her daughter, which has been attributed to her. I'll say attributed because, you know, they be lying on a girl.
This is all I know of Mary. That she is my death, and I am hers.
For Alicent, her position and comfort is meant to be protected by being the mother of the future king. And without that, there is no promise of her own security, especially since her own father, Otto Hightower, has been in conflict with many, including Prince Daemon, who is by extension going to be the king consort. One of the things that I think was left from the adaptation that was important is the fact that at a certain point, Alicent wanted to wed Rhaenyra and Aegon together in order to secure their positions, but that was shot down by Viserys, who thought that it was already going to be weird because in the book canon they are 10 years apart in age and have never gotten along.
She feels the earth washing away beneath her feet, and now she expects us to ignore her transgressions and for me to marry my only daughter to one of her plain-featured sons.
The proposal is a good one, my queen.
Throughout the dance, Alicent is often humbled and is forced to see the consequences of her own actions really come back to haunt her. And while I think that, yes, there is nuance to Alicent, we understand why she does the thing that she does, the reason she has fear while she values her children. The thing about it, and what complicates the idea that there is a actual true nuance to the narrative, is that in the text, she's beefing with a 9-year-old. Because there's a 9-year-old gap canonically between Alicent and Rhaenyra. By the time Alicent was queen, she was 18 and Rhaenyra was 9. Looking at Rhaenyra, we see this eldest daughter who watched her mother have to give birth to male heirs until it killed her. And mind you, in the book, Aemma started having children at 13. And then finally, her father makes her the heir. But not only does that, but was essentially being groomed to be his cupbearer from around the age of 8. What you will hear about Rhaenyra often is that she is proud and stubborn, and in allusion to Maegor, specifically that she will never forgive a slight. What you will also see said about Rhaenyra over and over again is her sexual life. Was she sleeping with Daemon? Was she sleeping with Sir Christian Cole? Like, her being a sexual person is used against her entirely. Well, that and the fact that she hated Alicent because Alicent was skinny and Rhaenyra was salty because she had a thick waist and big titties. And to be quite honest, I don't know why she would be mad at that arrangement. I think it's great, personally. But I think these things, the hypersexualization of Rhaenyra, the idea that she disliked Alicent because she was skinny, like, these things sound suspicious. And I think while people are trying to use them to create this kind of like dynamic narrative, to a certain degree, you as the reader should be suspicious of the interpretation of these figures. And I think part of the reason I feel like kind of prepared for this is because I cut my teeth on the Tudor fan base. And let me tell you, if there's a group of fandom that will make every decision about what a person in history really meant by who they like, it's people who love the Tudors, especially the 6 wives of Henry VIII.
Everybody knows that we used to be 6 wives, but now they're ex-wives.
So after the War of the Roses, King Richard III was killed in battle, becoming the last English monarch to die in battle. Good for him. This made way to the brief but iconic Tudor dynasty, featuring Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Catherine of Aragon.
Catherine of Aragon was married 24 years. I'm a paragon of royalty. My loyalty is to the Vatican, so if you try to dump me, you won't try that again.
My favorite. Anne Boleyn, the most popular one.
I'm that Boleyn girl and I'm up next. See, I broke England from the church. Yeah, I'm that sexy. Why did I lose my head? Well, my sleeves may be green, but my lipstick's red.
Jane Seymour, divisive.
Jane Seymour, the only one he truly loved.
Rude.
Anne of Cleves.
Ich bin Anne of Cleves.
Yeah. Catherine Howard.
Prick up your ears, I'm the Catherine who lost her head.
Beheaded.
All my promiscuity outside of wedlock.
And Catherine Parr.
I saw him till the end of his life. I'm the survivor, Catherine Parr.
The B Team. Fun fact, the last wife was named after the first one. Now you might be asking, how can there be a fan base for a royal family long dead of queen consorts. It is possible. One of the things I learned from the experience of being in the Tudor community is that even when presented with facts, due to a lot of issues, narratives about a particular figure can become complicated depending on who they are and what time the narrative comes up against. For example, Anne Boleyn is probably the most popular of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, not only because her story is interesting and her own appeal, but because she is in some part vindicated by having her daughter be Queen Elizabeth I. She was part of the reason why Henry VIII split up from the Catholic Church in order to divorce his first wife and create what would become the Church of England. One of the primary sources we have at this time is Eustace Chapuis, which I personally think is who Septim Eustace is kind of alluding to. That's just an opinion of mine. Who was the imperial ambassador for Spain. Due to this, he was biased in favor of Catherine of Aragon, who had been an infanta of Spain and aunt to the current king of Spain. Therefore, his commentary about Anne and Catherine will always be called somewhat into question, except when he is favorable or neutral towards Anne and somewhat critical of Catherine. His commentary and insight is important to shaping the history of this period, but it can never be divorced from the fact that he is Catholic, he is working to support Spain's interests, and he cares more about Catherine and her daughter, Mary Tudor, than Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth. You also see the evolution of narratives. A long time ago, Catherine Howard, who was a teenager, young adult when she was married to the king, was seen as being very sexually promiscuous. Now historians realize that Catherine Howard was not only taken advantage of sexually, but a lot of the allegations against her might have been done under duress or unclear, and that her relationship with Thomas Culpeper might have been coercive. This is what happens when you have the scope of historians evolving over time. You don't rewrite things, but you consider other perspectives and other contexts when you're deliberating what these people meant and thought. And this is important when you think about Alicent and Rhaenyra in the context of Fire and Blood. Between these two women, Alicent and Rhaenyra, you see the struggles that exist when you are queen consort versus a queen regent and what you get blamed for. The biggest issue, and this is a spoiler, is that Rhaenyra gets fucked over by taxes. Even though the Greens are responsible for ruining the treasury and there was no gold because they literally sent some of it away, it didn't remove the fact that she needed to have gold, and a new master of coin made those taxes so completely fucking absurd that it fucks over her popularity. She becomes the face of that, even though the roots of it are not on her shoulders, because she is the regent and she's also not beautiful and thin and young anymore, versus a queen consort or a princess who was allowed to just be beautiful. The emphasis on Rhaenyra's looks isn't just there to be shallow. It is to show how her value lessens when her having a bunch of kids ruins her figure. It's also sort of interesting how she gets paired with Helena, who is popular with the small folk, except that we never see anything about her doing anything. It's not like she's out here grassrooting or doing social issues. She is plump and happy and tragic and sympathetic, but she's not impacting policy. She's a consort. She's there to be a symbol of something larger than herself, to be a symbol of the crown.
When the people share our grief, they draw closer to us.
But I don't want them closer. I don't know them.
Sometimes we have to pretend.
The first-hand sources for a lot of what we have are, as I said before, Septim Eustace. I think in certain ways Eustace actually says things that are more in favor of Rhaenyra than Mushroom, and I think when you actually line up what they say happens line by line, a lot of times Eustace's opinion about what Rhaenyra did is actually more favorable than what Mushroom did. But again, it's a conflicting situation. But there is a degree of which Eustace is taken more seriously because he's a Septon versus Mushroom, who is a fool and therefore is treated as though intentionally comical. He does like to add a lot of sex and tits into stuff, so he does kind of Snyder himself by accident, derogatorily. If we look at parallels in history, Rhaenyra clearly takes inspiration from Empress Matilda, also known as Empress Maud. She faced the same sort of opposition due to her claim, the issue of female rulership. She was never fully able to become queen, but managed to control parts of England for several years. And ultimately, the anarchy ended with a compromise that saw her son being the successor, Henry II, who again would start the Plantagenet dynasty. And her claim would become important later on. Her legacy, while she never became a crowned queen of England, is that of how important it is for a queen to pass on power and to inherit fairly. But I think also who Rhaenyra has someone in common with is Queen Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, a very unpopular ruler for many valid reasons, but one of the historical figures I find fascinating. Like Rhaenyra, Mary had stepmother issues, the younger siblings who would be in competition for her position, and her body and lack of sexual desirability as she aged would become an issue surrounding her ability to perform the gender role of being both the queen, regent, but also being a woman in the public space. When Mary becomes queen, when she comes into London and overthrows Lady Jane, she is very popular because she was at one point the princess of the realm. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had always been popular, even though there is a disdain for foreigners among the population of England. They don't see Mary inherently as a foreigner because she is still her father's child. She tried to be merciful at first and then instantly imprison her half-sister Elizabeth, and while she tried not to kill Jane Grey at first, eventually after the next rebellion she had to eventually become Bloody Mary. And what in my mind damned Mary is the fact that she picked a husband that was doomed to be unpopular. And there are more nuanced reasons to this. I will link to some sources if you're really that interested, but I'm getting to a larger Game of Thrones related point, so I'm going to speed run through it. Mary picked Philip of Spain to be her husband, and many people fear that she would essentially be making England an extension of Spain, that they would be caught up in Spain's battles, and the marriage itself would mean that Mary would be subservient to Philip. And to a certain degree, she kind of wanted to do this. She was raised to be a consort, not a regnant. So a lot of that did end up happening. That's how they lost Calais. It was a loser-loser kind of moment for her. But it also illustrates through that marriage that it would be hard for her to marry anyway, because if she married an English person, that would be marrying a subject and choosing a faction. And due to her gender, she would be forced into an uncomfortable position. Foreignness was suspicious, but also like usually you marry someone of a different, kingdom to strengthen your allegiances. But because she's a woman, the assumption is if she marries a man, that man is going to take over and run everything in the streets. So while she was marrying to hopefully find someone who could be the male energy, she ended up marrying someone that would lead to people finding her suspicious, which is probably also why I see Daemon's marriage to Rhaenyra as something very similar. Marrying Daemon was the most reckless thing Rhaenyra ever did because his sins, real and imagined, were then pushed onto her. The pushback made both of them more insular, more needing to act out, and would lead to them endorsing more and more stringent ways to control each other. It breeds their paranoia because they're not liked. Their relationship is seen as a threatening to the Greens, and therefore it's going to lead us back and forth. It is both a character flaw and a reflection of the ways in which the madness of monarchy allows people to live these very petty insular lives and yet also be in control of the lives of so many people, and why the small folk ultimately suffer. So I guess ultimately all of this preamble, all of this jargon is to kind of get back to this whole thing of nuance. The argument of their lack of nuance in the adaptation, that there is nuance in the text itself. We are told, and it's kind of implied through the main series, that history is not kind to either Aegon II or Rhaenyra I. Why? Is it that they are equally bad people and that the Greens and the Blacks are just both war criminals? Yes and no. One of the biggest complaints I've seen around this latest season of House of the Dragon, even more so than before, is the lack of nuance between the two factions. The marketing has been pushing this idea of having to choose a side, and the actor who plays Otto Hightower recently declared that they're both genocidal, which, he's Welsh. Bars. And I think when it comes to the facts of Fire and Blood, even with the multiple biases and the story being shown to us in House of the Dragon is not the reality of what we're being shown, with all of those caveats upon caveats upon caveats, we can admit that as the war wages on, both teams were reaching too high and were focused on getting revenge. The egos of the Second Sons wanting to prove themselves was usually at play. And the Targaryens were still a very young dynasty that knew they had to show strengths, but they also self-mythologized themselves to a point where they believed their own hype. They are an overall selfish, self-serving imperial family that totally ignored the small folk and the responsibility they had as the safekeeper of the dragons to engage in this conflict. But Rhaenyra was still right to protect her rights as heir. And I also will say, the Greens are totally valid, even though their stuff is rooted in sexism, to fight for what they see as their own cause. I'm not saying that they don't have a perspective, but ultimately Rhaenyra was protecting her rights as heir. The root of sexism in the construction of the conflict is an intentional issue and why it's so important that misogyny be at the forefront of House of the Dragon and not like prophecy, but also like the self-entitlement of saying like, this is my divine right without like actually having a prophecy. You know, like the Targaryens already believe that they're like exceptionals. They don't need to like have a thing, a dream canonically to make that happen, you know? And I think this implies things that we're going to see in the books, especially because in the books, Dany is the last known confirmed Targaryen, but there's two other potential Targaryens. There's Jon Snow and the Young Griff theory. The Young Griff theory is that Young Griff, a character who does not appear in the show, but is in the books, is either raised up to think that he's like the dead Aegon Targaryen, Rhaegar and Elya's son, or that he really is it. Like either he's a real or he's a false dragon. He's a mummer's dragon, as they say. And these are two male claimants who could, just by the nature of their sex, take everything that Dany has worked for the entire series and just be like, well, it's mine now. And the realm would likely support that precedent because we have a history of accepting these men, going back to Fire and Blood.
What's that word you use?
Spoilers.
I like that word.
Rhaenyra's sons take the throne, right? And it's from her bloodline that several major characters, including the Baratheons, which is the bloodline that Robert will use for his own claim, will come. Yet history still casts her as an equal bad guy, which you would think would be risky considering that her family runs the throne. But there's a simple reason for that. And I think ultimately why, even as we think about her side not winning, but also being there, the issue is male primogeniture.
You mustn't ignore the certain truth that if Rhaenyra were to step over Aegon to ascend the throne, the realm would tear itself apart.
Rhaenyra will be a good queen.
It wouldn't matter if she were Jaehaerys himself, born again. Rhaenyra is a woman.
Primogeniture is the idea that the first legitimate child will inherit all the estates and wealth of their parent. There's absolute primogeniture, which means firstborn regardless of gender. There's matrilineal, which is through the maternal side, and also male primogeniture. So when Otto Hightower says in House of the Dragon that it would go against the laws of God and men to allow Rhaenyra to rule in favor of the king's firstborn son, this is what he's referring to. At this time, Dorne is not an official part of the Seven Kingdoms, so Rhaenyra doesn't even have that example of the Dornish principle of them having female heirs to even turn to, although she could use it anyway. We have an incident in the text where she is asked to decide the claim of an eldest daughter and is talked out of it because she is being told that her case is an exception to the rule, and that even though she's ascending, it is not her job to then change the rules of nature. And if you look at sort of like the way female queens were for a long time, that's also the case. It was until recently that like women couldn't inherit like baronies. Like, you know, Downton Abbey, the creator of that, Julian Fellows, he is married to a baroness. And like part of the reason why he even made that show and the whole conflict about Lady Mary inheriting is because like his wife could not inherit their title. It went extinct, I believe. I'll fact check it up here, because she's a woman and she couldn't inherit. And it's like you're literally living in a country where several women have become queen and other women can't inherit their own fake imperialist titles. Like, this is the reality. Monarchy is not good. Monarchy is not good. I think it's interesting how the Targaryens incorporate the doctrine of exceptionalism to allow themselves to marry within their family, even though incest is seen as sinful against the majority of the faith. And they're still picking and choosing when to enforce that exceptionalism. I mean, they could easily say that there were female leaders in Old Valyria. It's not like much survived. They could make some shit up. And there's nothing that says that dragon lords weren't women also, because we see women ride dragons. So if we're already having the Targaryens undo precedent, why not undo this? If what makes the blood of the dragon exceptional in all these ways, keep that same energy for your daughters. I think it's important to understand that, like, even though at the end of the day the war ends for a myriad of reasons, I won't get into it, because the desire to keep women in their place is so strong. And why is that important? Because in A Song of Ice and Fire, we can infer that part of why Dany will eventually have her mental breakdown is by having her claim supplanted by a male surprise Targaryen. I know this is all really interesting and it's fun, but part of why this exists is so that we can understand the main storyline. This is meant to explain Dany's place in the Targaryen line. We know more about this family than every other family in Westeros. Dany's space as a woman is key to her position in the story and the narrative in the story in general. What is the fault of both sides in this conflict? Is that that the Targaryens are cool and I love them as a family of characters. But if we're going to get into the depth of them, they are a family of people who conquered the kingdoms allegedly to protect it, and then did very little to protect it. Consider this. With how powerful and important the dragons are, allowing them to be used this way was lazy and negligent. Because at a certain point, it stopped being about protecting and defending the realm and just having the realm. What's a few thousand dead children who gets to sit on the Iron Throne? The quest for power in the face of grief is the sin. Both sides are corrupt for putting themselves before the small folk, but we should be under no illusions about who started it.
One night, a servant found the old king had died in his sleep and ran to inform Queen Alicent. Protocol dictated that the bells would be rung and a raven sent to Dragonstone to summon the heir, Princess Rhaenyra, for her coronation. But Alicent had other plans.
It was the Greens. And the Greens have a narrative that is meant to be fulfilled. They are very much like the Lannisters. They may not be the good guys, but they are interesting and they're complex. Like, I walked away from this season. I am 10 toes down an Aemond fan. Okay? My man. Like, he's biblically accurate like Sephiroth. Like, he's fine. And I'm just going to be true to myself. And Alicent's my second favorite character. Rhaenyra forever. You know, I love her. But again, even the Greens, well, they have their perspective and their point of view. And I think that point of view should be honored and adapted properly. This is their fault. And even the Rhaenyra the cruel stuff I think is interesting because it's like, cruel for what? It's too late. I can't be laughing this loud. House of the Dragon is not a perfect adaptation because unlike the book, it's not based on two conflicting sources. It is doing its own thing. It is also fighting against the issues that existed with Game of Thrones, and certain changes like making Rhaenyra's dragon be tied to Dany's by having Syrax be the mother of those eggs, using the anger we felt about Dany's story in order to add pain to Rhaenyra's story. Like, I don't think that that's the ideal way to tell the story because Dany grows up under Rhaenyra's impact, not vice versa. We don't need Rhaenyra to be the most generous, thoughtful, anti-war person ever to understand what's going on. Like the dragons are a metaphor for nuclear weapons. I understand that. But I also would like to be entertained. And I think that certain characters did evolve. I do like Alicent a lot, in theory. I like her background. I like that we know more about her backstory. I do miss her autonomy of wanting her kids to rule. We clearly see that Rhaenyra isn't a perfect person and it is more stubborn in her youth, but she mellows out after being a mother of several kids, of seeing their birthrights be challenged, of having to deal with the contention of her situation, of having to deal with the fact that, like, despite having, like, on paper power, as a woman, she can only really access so much of it. There is complexity of the Greens, and that Daemon has a right to dislike Otto and vice versa. That's valid. In fact, I think we understand a lot of the background of everything in certain ways, and I love that about the show. I think that it's super good that we have that development, but it also makes very clear fundamentally that Rhaenyra's real mistake was being born a woman. And I don't think that's an accident or like an interpretation. Like, that's the reality of what Fire and Blood is saying. And I think that, at least with the Dance of the Dragons, every time I read about it, I feel sad about all the things that were not able to be prevented, all the death, the destruction, the chaos. And I also see how avoidable it would have been if people had just, like, thought about the realm. And the reality is no one was.
When Rhaenyra heard of her son's death, she collapsed. She considered ending the war right then, until a raven arrived from her husband, Daemon. Her son would be avenged.
That's the video. It was super long and weird and history driven, but I don't know. I feel like so many people read Fire and Blood like line for line perfectly, and even I remind myself, like, this is not like an actual narrative. This is a history book summed up. And I think it's just so important to ask yourself, like, what are the narratives that are being told in this storytelling? Who's saying it? What do these things mean? How do they align? Does this make sense with what you think an actual person, a human being, would do? I think the show is fine. It has problems. And I think fundamentally, going back to House of Dragon real quick, until the series ends, we will not really know if these changes were good or not. I personally don't think the changes made to Alicent are good. I think Daemon is fundamentally kind of also misunderstood. I miss Nettles. I really dislike the fact that, like, a canonically black character was not included in the series. Like, I know we have all these Valyrian blacks, but it would have been nice to just have, you know, a non-attached to Valyrian Black character in there, especially there's so much nuance to like her own heritage and how she ends up being a dragon rider. Like that is such an interesting story. And again, they didn't do shit with Rhaena anyway, but I'm waiting for the show to prove to me that they made the right decision, because right now with certain characters, it's a no, but overall it's fine. We gonna be all right. Also, I didn't have a problem with the kiss. I liked it. Let's go, lesbians. Let's fucking go.
Gentlemen, I'm addressing them, undressing them, got elegance. Means not quite yet to be eloquent, get it then, that's good. You could be my guest, so let's take it to a fancy dinner. After we dine, I'm dancing with ya. Name's June and I got a rose, but I gotta go do what? I don't know, but you're not the one. Hey, shout outs to Adam, OG Vibe crew. I am not working and never living ever to get a chick. Is that much work? Whatever, bitch. Friend zone, yeah, go both ways. I'm a bright side looking, bright-eyed student. Sideline looking for discoveries of the guys and women couples, but I'm good looking enough. And fighting for love is overrated. There are other things I can do. Chilling with Adam, eating White Castle. Love ain't a game, more like a raffle. Gold tickets ain't gotten by skill, hard work or will. For real, you find him in chocolate. Ha ha. Bust out the Cheetos, we that, cause we ain't the heroes. Well, the dudes drinking Mountain Dew, feeling pretty good about it all, and not city of pissed off. It's the small things that you eat when you're broken and your heart feels like it's beat. Crush the shit off, cause I'm talking about a feast. So what's it gonna be? You want a number 3 from Blanco Portrait. On a date, make ladies swoon. Laying at a park, gaze at the moon. Smooth, in a poetic spot. You know I get her to talk, to put her head to my cut. That is not me, I am sloppy. I fuck up my witty one-lines and drop things. Not to over-exaggerate, but who'll get over a girl I master break. Dance and then walk it off, it will pass on and off. I love this girl, God only knows that's okay, cause I like roads. I like walking and I hate pity, long as I got my friends with me. Sooner or later I gotta get lucky, what I don't get is why I am drowning. Not caught in it, like that kid, and trails infinite, and quitting ain't a limit, but a limit so much I can take. I'm really giving when I kick it at the end of the day. That's all I can do, all there is to it. On to the next one after the music. I'm still June and I got a rose, but I gotta go do what? I don't know, but she's not. It's the